Now, probably the most significant shift in the world since I made my last video regarding pandemic anyway, and related to everything really, is that the CDC has released numbers that prove, finally, and fairly incontrovertibly, that the death rate for the phenomenon that's being called Rona 20-1 is indeed around 0.2%. So this is the CDC's own data, and these are numbers that don't even take into account the widespread and widely acknowledged manipulation or outright fabrication around official causes of death. So by now we've all heard that in the US, hospitals receive a significantly higher amount of money when a death is coded as a Rona death as opposed to boring old influenza or pneumonia or cancer. And it seems as though a really significant number of terminally ill patients had their records doctored, if you will. But the rampant lies and cover-ups aside, even according to the CDC's own numbers, distorted as they surely are on account of institutional corruption, even the CDC's own numbers confirm that Rona's death rate is at about 0.2%. What a relief. It's over. Now we have confirmation that all the fear and the panic was unwarranted because this supposed disease is on par in its deadliness with the seasonal influenza. Now, of course, we don't want to minimize the seriousness of the seasonal flu. We all know or should know that the flu, heck, the common cold can kill as well. And as I've mentioned before, my own father died as a result of the seasonal flu. It was very unexpected. But it still must be an enormous relief for the population of the world to know that we can end the entirety of this nonsensical operation that was based on the incorrect assumption that this apparent virus is exceptionally dangerous, because we now know that it's not. And so because of this newfound statistical knowledge, surely the lockdown in all of its various iterations, because it's still ongoing in many places, including Canada, surely every aspect of this lockdown and all of its related bylaws and guidelines will be revoked and we can resume our lives, right? And, I think that very few of us actually want things to go back to normal, right? We're all aware that what was considered to be normal, the consumerist grind, it was anything but normal. And I think there's, we're all really feeling that there's so much room for a beautiful revisioning of our lives and our societies, but surely we can begin that process. The rebuilding of our families, the rebuilding of our businesses, and most importantly, beginning the work of repairing some of the terrible damage that's been done to our sense of cohesion and safety, and to the trust we have in our connection with other people. Surely now we can do away with all of the restrictions that have been placed on our movement and our socializing. Surely now we can once again literally embrace each other in the streets and move about the world unrestricted. Surely all our borders can be reopened. And thank God we can now abandon this horrific dystopian and completely unnecessary program, contact tracing, which is of course state surveillance. That can be done away with, right? We can now dismiss the ridiculous, macabre notion of waiting for an injectable pharmaceutical prophylactic that anyone with any understanding of any aspect of this will know is very unlikely to be effective. It's very unlikely to be safe. Researchers have never been able to create a safe or effective injectable prophylactic against any type of Rona ever before. And really, the idea is, it's a little bit absurd, right? That life can't go back to normal without this. And most significantly, I think, now that we have access to the facts around this supposed Rona's deadliness, there's no requirement for any of this, right? And actually, Moderna, one of the manufacturers of injectable pharmaceutical prophylactics, considered to have the most promising start to developing an injectable prophylactic for Rona, they began their first trial on April 14th of this year. So they had a total of 45 test subjects, randomly assigned a specific dose of this prophylactic. So that translated into 3 groups of 15 individuals who were given low, medium, and high doses. And according to Moderna's own press release, quote, "To date, the most notable adverse events were seen at the high dose level, comprising 3 participants with grade 3 systemic symptoms only following the second dose." This means that 3 out of 15 test subjects experienced severe adverse effects. No mention of long-term effects, of course. We have to wait to find out about that. And thankfully, some intelligent people out there, they extrapolated this data out to the US population of 330 million people, and they observed that even if 1/8 of the population only took this prophylactic, that would mean that 8.25 million people might experience a severe adverse event from the prophylactic itself. Obviously, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense to take on that kind of enormous risk to supposedly alleviate the much smaller risk from a disease that is no more dangerous or deadly than the seasonal influenza. And we've got an injectable prophylactic for influenza, but that hasn't been much of a panacea, has it? In any case, I'm sure that all the mainstream news outlets will very soon be proclaiming far and wide that the trials for this new injected prophylactic will be shut down, and that governments will be doing everything they possibly can to recoup their wildly indiscriminate investments in those pharmaceutical prophylactic trials, and that instead all that money will be given back to the people so that we can restore and hopefully save our small businesses and rebuild our families, right? Surely governments will be scrambling to proclaim that everything that has happened over the past 3 months has been an enormous mistake. Surely we'll be hearing from our politicians apologizing for their drastic infringements on our freedoms and taking responsibility for their unbelievable failures. But so far we haven't heard anything. But it must be just right around the corner, surely. But this is not about a virus. Instead of a glorious outpouring of relief and righteous anger to be expected, there are heaps of people growing more and more attached to their beloved masks. People who are downloading their favorite contact tracing apps to do their part, and who are getting ready eagerly to roll up their sleeves so that they might be among the first to take advantage of the shiny new pharmaceutical prophylactic that's still being sold to us right around the corner, courtesy, again, of the world's favorite charismatic computer programmer. I think it was the New York Times that just recently compared him to the lovable Mr. Rogers. To be honest, I was never a huge fan of Mr. Rogers myself. I always found him a little bit insincere, but sacrilege, I know. There are lots of people who are starting to wake up to the sea of deranged incongruities, contradictions, and reversals in every area of life as we now know it, who can see that despite the fact that Rona is not more dangerous or deadly than the seasonal flu, the madness for some reason continues. And so very many of these people are seeing through the discrepancies around the bigger picture here. And yet, in Clearwater County, Alberta, land use bylaws have recently been amended, including the restriction of CRA designations. So from the bylaw document itself, quote, "No sales of livestock or sales of the production associated with livestock is permitted," end quote. This means that farmers in Clearwater County, Alberta, cannot sell their farm fresh eggs or honey or their farm animals. It's very curious. In Singapore, Spot, a macabre canine patrol robot, is monitoring public parks. Spot has the capacity to recognize faces and can be connected to a main server with or without an operator. Spot is enabled with the formidable power to connect to the newly implemented Atlanta Falcons network. let's face it, too, Spot is probably weaponized. Why not? Or possibly could be. Spot, the sign that was put up in the Singapore park, reads, quote, is able to traverse through various terrains autonomously and will aid in ensuring safe distancing in parks and gardens. We seek your cooperation, not to disrupt it. California Department of Social Services recently released a document that reads, quote, as a participant in state assistance benefits, you are being informed that Rona 20-1 testing is declared mandatory for all members of your household receiving assistance. Failure to obtain a test by June 1st, 2020 will result in the temporary suspension of your benefits beginning July 1st, 2020, and will continue until such time that testing has been completed. Should you test positive, the Human Services Agency of Merced County may deem it necessary to remove all children under the age of 18 from your household who have tested negative and place them in temporary foster care until such time that you have been determined to be recovered. It's chilling. An example from my own neck of the woods of the inane policies that, to my mind, really demonstrate beyond the shadow of a doubt that this supposed pandemic is indeed a psychological operation, in addition, of course, to the simple fact that this is not deadlier than the flu, according to the CDC, is that across Canada and probably all over the world, but specifically in the province of New Brunswick where I live, businesses have been invited to reopen as long as they obey a set of imbecilic rules and regulations that include maintaining the utterly arbitrary and entirely unscientific, even in the context of a dangerous disease, 6.5 feet of distance between individuals, and that if this cannot be facilitated, the sanctioned workaround, the acceptable course of action, the authorized procedure according to the government of New Brunswick, is to install plastic partitions throughout the premises, whether that be expensive heavy plexiglass or shower curtains even. Apparently that works too, to ensure the health and safety of patrons. A recent CTV News article shared the heartwarming story of a hair salon owner who indeed has hung shower curtains throughout their salon, as though even if viruses did spread person to person, indiscriminately infecting everyone in their wake, which I don't believe is the case, and even if Rona was more dangerous and more deadly than the flu, which we now know absolutely is not the case according to the CDC's own released data, even if this was a dangerous virus, and even if germ theory were true, the idea that hanging pieces of thin plastic, unsealed, open at the ceiling, open at the floor, flapping in the wind, would actually do anything at all to mitigate the dispersion of this imaginary virus? It's so profoundly ludicrous, it really is hard to contemplate. Surely any person with even the most infinitesimal grasp of reality could see that this approach is nothing more than an absolute charade, a pantomime. But Karen needs her haircut, so what other options do we have? When it comes to Rona, the disease that we now know is undeniably, irrefutably, clearly no more dangerous than the seasonal flu, according to the CDC. The disease that has killed 0 people in New Brunswick, what other option do we have other than to develop a grueling, monotonous, moronic, wasteful, counterproductive list of tasks, including draping plastic sheeting all over Hell's Half Acre to save ourselves from our own delusion? But of course, this is not about a virus. The very conceptualization of Rona, the response to Rona, the continued operatic charade of Rona is proof in itself that the game is rigged. The entire world has been tricked into thinking that Rona 20-1 is not only deadlier than the seasonal flu, but that it justifies a global lockdown. each and every time I've referred to Rona very, very deliberately as a flu-like virus, as I've been doing, again, deliberately since early March, a shrill chorus ranging from righteous concern to superior condescension to outright rage from those who are committed to rationalizing the narrative that to support lockdown is to be a compassionate person, to the degree that it's become a dearly beloved part of their identity, is almost deafening. But Rona is not statistically deadlier than the seasonal flu. I'm actually going to reference a recently published article in the Conservative Review, and don't worry, I'll address that source in a moment. Quote, "The CDC has attempted to offer a real estimate of the overall death rate for Rona 20-1, and under its most likely scenario, that number, the death rate, is 0.26%. Officials estimate a 0.4% fatality rate among those who are symptomatic and project a 35% rate of asymptomatic cases among those infected, which drops the overall infection fatality rate to just 0.26%. Almost exactly where Stanford researchers pegged it a month ago, according to the CDC's own data. Until now, we have been ridiculed for thinking the death rate was that low, as opposed to the 3.4% estimate of the World Health Organization, which helped drive the panic and the lockdowns. Now the CDC is agreeing to the lower rate in plain ink. Plus, ultimately, we might find out that the infection fatality rate is even lower because numerous studies and hard counts of confined populations have shown a much higher percentage of asymptomatic cases. Simply adjusting for a 50% asymptomatic rate would drop their fatality rate to 0.2%, exactly the rate of fatality Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford University projected. More importantly, the overall death rate is meaningless because the numbers are so lopsided. Given that at least half of the deaths were in nursing homes, a back-of-the-envelope estimate would show that the infection fatality rate for non-nursing home residents would only be 0.1%, or 1 in 1,000. And that includes people of all ages and all health statuses outside of nursing homes, since nearly all of the deaths are those with comorbidities. The CDC estimates the death rate from Corona 20-1 for those under 50 is 1 in 5,000 for those with symptoms, which would be 1 in 6,725 overall. But again, almost all of those who die have specific comorbidities or underlying conditions. Those without them are more likely to die in a car accident. And school children whose lives, mental health, and education we are destroying are more likely to get struck by lightning." End quote. So again, I'll keep repeating this over and over and over. According to those numbers from the CDC, Rona 20-1 has a similar mortality rate to the seasonal influenza, if not a lower mortality rate. But we've locked down the world. We've put global citizens on house arrest, destroyed small businesses, destroyed people's livelihoods, driven an enormous number of people to suicide, to murder. We've closed parks and playgrounds. We've isolated people away from their loved ones to die alone. And we have further empowered the police to misuse their authority, which they are doing with aplomb, with apparent delight, harassing parents who've dared to play with their children in green spaces, administering fines to middle-aged men who dare to sit in their vehicles finishing their coffee and muffin from Tim Hortons, and that was actually in Hampton, a little town not far from where I live. So surely we can put a stop to all of this now, that we can see in plain ink that this is akin to the flu. At the beginning of April, British Columbia Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry spoke publicly on the restrictions placed on Canadian citizens, and in response to questions about the seeming arbitrariness of the new restrictions that varied quite widely across the country, Henry said, quote, "All gatherings are off the table. We're in that place where any time we get together with more than our household members, we're putting ourselves at risk, and particularly if we're in contact with people who are older. But," said Henry, "none of these restrictions are based on scientific evidence." Quote, "There is some evidence or modeling that Alberta has done that shows that if you have less than 18 people gathering, your probability is less, but the bottom line is," said Dr. Bonnie Henry, "that none of this is based on science." End quote. This is BC's health minister. This is a doctor. It's all very, very interesting. It's all quite strange.